In addition to being an incredible work of art, Silent Hill 2 is different from about 90% of other video games out there. And the reason for this is because of its story, which is very unique in terms of how it is driven. And if you're wondering where I came up with the 90% different from other games, just remember that 67% of all statistics are made up right on the spot. Now, what makes Silent Hill 2's story different from most other video game stories is actually the driving force behind the story. Most other video games are conflict-driven. In Resident Evil, the characters are going up against the Umbrella Corporation. In Super Mario Bros., it's Mario and his friends fighting Bowser. In Sonic the Hedgehog, it's Sonic and his friends versus Dr. Robotnik. Even in other Silent Hill games, it's the protagonist versus the cult of Silent Hill. In Silent Hill 4, it's emotionless hunk of wood Henry Townsend versus cultist Walter Sullivan. But Silent Hill 2's story isn't conflict-driven, it's question-driven. And that question is even stated by the protagonist James Sunderland himself. What is that question?
Is she really alive, waiting for me?
Now, saying that Silent Hill 2 is question-driven doesn't mean that there aren't questions in conflict-driven stories or conflicts in question-driven stories. In the case of Silent Hill 2, it just means there isn't an overarching conflict for the whole narrative. Unless you consider the conflict to be an internal one, in which James resolves it by murdering the physical manifestation of Mary's illness and his own repressed guilt. I think I just destroyed the thesis of this video. Alternate takes aside, the game developers very deliberately set up this question-driven story. And I'm a writer, so you can trust me. To do this, what the story has to do is have an event occur that's unexpected or impossible. In Silent Hill 2, that event is James receiving a letter from his wife Mary telling him she's waiting for him in their special place in Silent Hill. The second thing a story needs to provide is the context indicating why it's impossible or unexpected. In Silent Hill 2's case, it's that his wife has been dead for 3 years. Ooh. But a question-driven game doesn't just set up a question and turn the audience loose. It also must build intrigue and complicate that initial question over time. And Silent Hill 2 does this in essentially 3 ways. But before we look at how Silent Hill 2 complicates the initial question, there's something else in the opening that helps to set up later complications to that question. In the letter James gets from his wife, it states that she's waiting at their special place. James doesn't know where this is and thinks that perhaps the special place she refers to is the park by the lake. James marks it on his map and decides to go there. Gameplay-wise, the player might think this location is just a functional way of motivating the gameplay, which it is. Story-wise, you might think that it's just the logical thing for a man searching for his wife to do, given such a vague clue as their special place. But placing the park as a goal at the beginning of the game does something else story-wise, and that's that it sets up an expectation for the audience. And that expectation is that when you get to the park, you will either find Mary or not find Mary. This expectation sets up the complications that come later in the story, which will then heighten audience intrigue. As I was saying, the game does complicate the initial question in essentially 3 ways. The first one is with the character of Laura, the second one is with the character Maria, and the third way is with the supernatural elements of Silent Hill. Technically, you could say that Maria is an aspect of the supernatural elements of Silent Hill, but I feel that she's separate enough that she should really be her own thing. The supernatural aspects are the simplest of the bunch. These are things such as Mary's voice coming through the radio, her dress in the apartment building at the beginning of the game, etc., etc. In the hotel, James even hears Mary call his name in the 3rd floor stairwell. These are simple things that pepper the game with mystery. The second way the game builds intrigue around the central question is Maria. The expectation set at the beginning of the game of we'll either find Mary at the park or not is paid off when we reach the park and find not Mary but Maria, a woman who looks exactly like Mary except
Your hair and clothes are different.
Meeting Maria causes several questions to be raised. Chiefly, why does this woman look like Mary? Could this be Mary? And who is this woman? These questions are further complicated when Maria Maria rests in one of the rooms at Brookhaven Hospital. She starts coughing badly as if she is ill. She takes some pills, and when James returns to the room once he's in the other world, Maria is gone and several pill bottles are on the table. This of course implies illness. Later in the hospital, we see Maria get killed by Pyramid Head. Later in the Nowhere stage, James encounters Maria again. This is something unexpected and impossible. She speaks to James as if she's Mary and remembers things that only Mary would know, but she's clearly not Mary. This whole interaction again complicates and builds intrigue around the questions pertaining to Maria. Who is she? Why does she look like Mary? And of course, it further complicates the central question of, could Mary be in this town? It also raises the question, could Maria actually be Mary? The last way the story complicates that central question is through the character of Laura. Upon first meeting her, she seems to know Mary and James. During the second encounter with Laura, James asks the obvious questions implied by her presence in Silent Hill. How do you know Mary, and why are you in Silent Hill? This all escalates the intrigue around the central question. When James encounters Laura at the hospital, unlike with Maria, he actually gets answers to the questions presented earlier. Those answers being, Laura's in town looking for Mary, and her and Mary met at the hospital a year ago. Laura mentions a letter she got from Mary, and James wishes to read it. Laura, however, pretends like she lost it and ends up locking James in a room with monsters. Without giving him the letter to read, this deliberate withholding of context leaves the audience with yet another series of questions, such as, did Laura meet Mary a year ago in the hospital despite James believing that Mary has been dead for 3 years? And what does the letter say? Well, when James meets Laura at the hotel, he gets to read the letter, confirming that Laura did meet Mary in the hospital a year ago. Not only this, but James also learns that Laura's letter was written not long ago, leading to the next question. That question being,
Could she really be here?
which of course complicates this question.
Is she really alive, waiting for me?
And of course, every question-driven story requires an answer to that central question, and any writer worth their salt will answer that question in a really interesting and memorable way. And if you played Silent Hill 2, you know that the developers have pulled this off incredibly well. They have created an immensely interesting answer to the initial question, and it's so interesting that people are still talking about it today. Like me. Yep, it's one of the biggest twists in video games. As it turns out, Mary didn't die 3 years ago. She died weeks ago, having been euthanized by James, who could no longer watch her suffer or suffer from her abuse as she slowly grew sicker over time. Being so traumatized by this action, he completely blocked out the last 3 years of his life. Now, this aspect of repressed memory is something that other games really tried to mimic later, but really, it's isolated to this story specifically for the reasons of being an interesting answer to the question. Now, the Silent Hill games, all of the Silent Hill games, all present engaging questions to be answered, and it's one of the reasons Silent Hill games endure over time, both because they are interesting questions, but also because the Silent Hill games don't always answer those questions. Sometimes they give possible answers, hinting at them through bits of story and motif, keeping some things vague and allowing the player to draw their own conclusions. It's one of the reasons people still talk about these games today, particularly Silent Hill 2, which raises many questions left to the player to answer on their own. Many of those questions have actually been answered by players and fans, such as who and what Maria is, as well as Pyramid Head. However, there is still a great deal of debate over certain things in Silent Hill 2. There is still much debate amongst players over many of the unanswered questions in the Silent Hill games. However, Silent Hill 2 is unique amongst most video games for the sheer fact that its unanswered questions are the central driving force of its story, and it is that sole fact alone that makes Silent Hill different from many other games. And it's a reason why we still talk about this game and this game series today. For me personally, I'm left with really only one question when I'm done playing Silent Hill, and that question is, why the fuck are there so many damn blondes in this game? Hey, if you enjoyed this video, please check out this video. It's on Biofreaks for the Nintendo 64. Or check out my long documentary about Silent Hill 1. It's a doozy. I'm kind of proud of it. Check it out.